To SeaWorld Research and Rescue Center. I am Dr. Elise, and I'm very pleased to see you all tonight for this 9th edition of our Science Talk series. I will have Claudia Stuber, the chair of the Emirates Natural History Group Abu Dhabi, introducing the evening and our speaker, but I wanted to give a big thank you to all our partners who are helping developing this series. And so I wanted to name the Environment Agency Abu Dhabi, the Emirates Natural History Group Abu Dhabi, the Natural History Museum Abu Dhabi, and Nautica Environmental Associates. I'm particularly proud to be hosting this Abu Dhabi stop of the book tour of Dr. John Burt. It's quite an honor for me, and I had just a little thought for Professor Peter Sell, because thanks to him, I met Dr. John Burt 17 years ago, and so this is quite a long adventure that brought us here tonight. So please have a seat, and we are starting. Claudia, if you want to come.
So I'm very happy to introduce Dr. John Burt, Professor Dr. John Burt from the New York University today. And John Burt is the head of the Marine Biology Lab at the New York University Abu Dhabi, where he is the co-director of the Mubadala Arabian Center for Climate and Environmental Sciences. And he's also involved in several other research centers. He has been with NYU Abu Dhabi since 2009, and in this time he has published over 130 scholarly articles and book chapters, mainly on the unique marine biology of this region. But he has also had a long engagement with the Emirates Natural History Groups, both as a member and a regular speaker, and was awarded the 2017 Sheikh Mubarak Al Nahyan Award for the Natural History of the United Arab Emirates. The book we are about to discuss tonight is an example of his contributions in this area, where he led the development of this 24 chapters, 750-page book made up of contributions from 20 subject matter experts across the Emirates, many of them active members of the natural history groups of the UAE, to create this valuable source that was written specifically for the general public to inspire them to get out and enjoy nature of the Emirates. And even when it's hot, you will find a time gap that is suitable for you to go out and do it. The book, called A Natural History of the Emirates, will become an important milestone for nature education and awareness. And we are happy to have John here today to give us a glimpse of what we can expect. So,
thank you all for coming and attending this evening's lecture. So I get paid as an academic to talk in 75-minute intervals, but I'll try and keep it to 60 minutes tonight. And it's my real pleasure to be here. I'd like to extend my thanks to Elise and the whole SeaWorld community for hosting us here. I think it's particularly important for the support that they're giving to the Emirates Natural History Group. It's a long-standing association that we'll discuss a little bit, that I think really does help inspire people's interest in this amazing country that we all call home. So when most people think of the UAE, they think of these glittering skyscrapers and the fantastic architecture that we have that sort of characterizes this area. You know, we went from a country of less than 100,000 people in the 1960s to about 10 million people today. And so there's been an amazing transformation of this country as a result of that. And the UAE really has become a nexus for cultural exchange, for business, and for people like ourselves to enjoy this amazing country that we have. But I think there's a real opportunity to gain more appreciation of the other side of the UAE, which is the natural ecosystems and organisms and environment that we have here in the Emirates, which is really what inspired me to pull this book together that we're going to be talking about tonight. So this book, I do have a copy of it here to just show you the heft of this tome. It is 800 pages long almost, and it contains over 450 color images that really do provide sort of a nice picture of this amazing country that we live in. So this is fully open access. It is freely available for you to download, to put on your tablets, read on your laptop, take it on your phone on the plane, or you can buy the hard copy of the book if you'd like. And I do have a few copies that are outside that I'll be signing afterwards for people who do go old school. So I haven't read a paper book in probably 20 years, but I know that there's lots of folks that still enjoy having that heft. So I hope you've exercised your wrist, because it is a bit of a tome, but it is an amazing resource for people to learn from. And I'm particularly interested in the people who are in the education sector, using this to sort of inspire the students that you have in your classes to get out there and see some of these amazing places that we'll be talking about. So just a little bit on the evolution of natural history here in the Emirates. This is not something that's new. So, of course, the Emirati community has a long tradition of working and living in this environment and has an oral history that has been passed down from generation to generation. But as Westerners, a lot of us focus on the written records, and the start of the written records were coming mainly from military campaigns, largely from the British. There were some others, people that were coming in with the East India Company and so on and so forth. So, you know, this is going on in the 1840s, 1850s, where people were coming and exploring this country, grabbing samples and then sending them back, unfortunately, to the places like the London Natural History Museum and so on, where they're still archived today. You know, as the trades increased through this region and the larger sort of global context sort of morphed out, and the UAE and the surrounding countries, which was then the Trucial States, of course, became more integrated in this global network, things continued to engage. We start seeing around the 1960s, so we had the discovery of oil in the 1930s, and then an influx of foreigners who were sort of supporting this nascent oil industry. And we start to see people like this fellow here, Kinsman, in 1964, wrote a paper in Nature. So Nature is one of the top 2 journals in the world. And he was actually describing the coral reefs of Abu Dhabi because of their amazing heat tolerance. So he's talking about the fact that we've got the world's hottest sea here, and there's corals thriving in this ecosystem across the coast of Abu Dhabi. And this really is the start of the natural history movement here in the UAE, where people were resident rather than just visiting the place. And you've got to recognize this is in the 1950s and 1960s. These folks were coming here. They're all alpha, highly educated people working in these industries. They're obviously pioneering spirits as well, because they're moving halfway across the world to go to these unique countries that are surrounding the Gulf. But of course, there's no television that's in English at that point. We don't have streaming Netflix. So what are you going to do on the weekend? You're going to leave the office and head out into the countryside. And that's what these folks were doing. So much of the early natural history of the UAE was actually people like this geologist talking about coral reefs, or a petroleum engineer talking about butterflies. And so that's really the start of this nascent natural history movement here. And for a large part, much of the natural history knowledge that's been written down here in the UAE has been written by amateurs. So people who are not specialists in the specific field that they're talking about, but rather people interested in the environment and recording what they see out there in nature and putting that down for posterity. And so I would estimate that roughly 85 to 90% of all natural history knowledge in the UAE was actually generated by dedicated amateurs, like the folks that are members of the Emirates Natural History Group today. So I'd encourage you to, if you want, talk to Brigitte or various other, Claudia, other members of the Natural History Group if you're interested in engaging in that sort of stuff. So we had the establishment of the Natural History Group as an institution around 1977. At the same time, we get our first academic setting here with the establishment of the UAE University. The country's maturing. We see a natural history group opening in Dubai as well as Al Ain over the next couple of years. There's the start of the Bulletin of the Natural History Group, which later became the Gazelle. A couple of years later, in the early 1990s, we had the Tribulus, which is their scientific journal. All of these things are sort of evolving as we go through time. At the same time, the academic environment's increasing. We had the higher colleges, Zayed University getting established, and then later the institution that I'm involved with today, New York University Abu Dhabi. And so we're seeing a transition now from much of the knowledge that's being generated being from amateurs to professional researchers. But I would like to underscore the importance of the amateurs and just passionate people like yourselves getting out there and recording what they see here in this amazing country of ours. And we continue to see new things today, even in this very well-studied country that we have. So I had the pleasure, one of my funders is Dalio Philanthropies, and they have this amazing research vessel that's called Ocean Explorer under their Ocean X umbrella. And I got to dive down to the deepest points on the East Coast UAE, the east coast of the UAE. So this submarine that I'm sitting in right here goes down to 1,000 meters, and they have an ROV that goes down to 6,000 meters. So we were off the coast of Fujairah, diving, looking at deep water coral reefs, for example. So this is what's called a mesophotic coral reef that we discovered at 150 meters depth. It is basically black there. There's almost no light. Yet we have these amazing ecosystems that occur in these environments, and there's fish floating around these areas. We know nothing about them. So how do you protect something that you don't even know is there? You can't. And this literally was a mile away from the Fujairah anchorage for the very massive port that's there. So it's a critical habitat that's probably thousands of years old that we're just recently discovering. We also found the casts of roots of mangrove trees at about 130 meters depth. So that's where the coastline was during the last ice age. And this shark that you can see here is a bramble shark. And this is the first discovery of a bramble shark in the UAE. I'll just skip up here a little bit so you can see this guy. So we did not know that this species of shark occurred here. We found it when we were at around 850 meters depth, and then we found more, and we found more, and we found more. So in that really deep trench that's off the UAE's east coast, there's a whole community of these sharks floating around that we didn't even know existed. So really still a lot to discover here in the UAE. So I'd encourage especially the younger members of the crowd here tonight to get into science, and maybe you'll get to do some fun stuff like this as well. The book itself is dedicated in large part to the memory of this amazing person that you can see here, Peter Hellier. Many of you in the room knew him. He's from Jersey in the UK, but is also a UAE citizen because of the contributions he's made to the Emirates from archaeology to natural history to the environment over the many years that he was here. So he was here since, I think, the 1970s, and just recently passed away at the end of last year. So you know, what inspired me to start getting into the natural history movement was one of the books that he and Simon Aspinall had put together back in 2004, which was called The Emirates and Natural History. So this was sort of a coffee table book with a lot of beautiful photos in it, but again, it was one of those things that inspired me to get out there and learn more, because I wanted to see these places or see these organisms that were in there. And really, the sort of ultimate driver for me to pull this book together was the pandemic, where I got stuck in my house and I couldn't do anything, like many of us did. But at the same time, I'm teaching these students at New York University Abu Dhabi. So we have students from over 125 countries that are part of our academic community there. They move into the UAE, they go on to Saadiyat Island, and they sit in these beautiful dorms that we have for students, and very rarely get out of that, and other than doing sort of the traditional desert safari. And so I was thinking, wouldn't it be great to be able to offer a course for these students to teach them about their adopted country? And so that's where the genesis of the book came from, so that I could develop this course. Because when I started looking around, we had lots of information. None of it was in a centralized place. It's in technical journals or other areas that are really inaccessible, government reports and so on. So pulling together this book was really to give a resource not just to my students to learn about our adopted country, but the expats that are in the room here as well. So we wrote this specifically for an educated lay audience who's interested in exploring nature here in the UAE. So I'm going to structure this talk today as sort of a teaser for the book. So I'm basically walking through the first section of the book, which is the physical setting that sort of drives life and what life can occur here. So I'll talk a little bit about geography and almost nothing about geology, a bit about the climate here, which of course you're very familiar with. It's starting to get to that season, and a little bit about the marine environment because my background's in marine biology, so I have to give credence to the unique marine environment that we have here as well. And the reason I'm starting with the physical setting of the UAE is, of course, that this is the stage on which life will play out. And so the geography, the geology is what serves as the foundation for everything else to build on. And so with the climate and these various other factors playing together, it really structures what vegetation can grow, and the vegetation then structures the rest of the food web. And so critically important to sort of structuring how food webs can develop and life can occur here in the UAE. And when we think of the UAE, it really is a mosaic of a whole bunch of unique physical environments. We've, of course, got the mountains on the east coast, we've got the giant sand dunes in the Rub al Khali, and so on and so forth. And it's this mosaic that is driving differences in life that we get across the Emirates. And so when we're talking about geography, for example, it's not just the slope and the type of material that's there, but the hydrology of those areas that's also interacting with the climate, as well as even the vegetation that's occurring there to help structure the rest of that life. And so we're going to start by talking a little bit about the geographic divisions of the UAE. And so we're going to walk through these four principal divisions that you can see sort of colored over here. And I'm colorblind, so I'm going to yell out colors occasionally that don't at all match what's on the screen, so just bear with me. So this bluish zone here is our coastal plain. We also have, of course, that's running basically from Sila at the border of Saudi Arabia and Qatar, all the way up to Ras Al Khaimah. We, of course, have the largest component of the UAE, which is the sandy deserts that you can see here in orange, yellow. We, of course, have the mountains on the east coast of the UAE, the Hajar Mountains largely, but also Rus Al Jabal, which we'll talk about, and cascading off both to the east and the west of the mountain ranges are what are called the alluvial plains. So these are the gravel that's washing off of the mountains over tens of millennia. And so we get these gravel plains that occur in these areas. And all of these different habitats have their own unique characteristics, they have their own unique microclimates, and that helps drive the diversity of life that you see in these different areas. And so the coastal plains, as I mentioned, run all the way from the border of Sila up to Ras Al Khaimah and basically extend inwards about 25 to 40 kilometers, depending on where you are. And you'll see in these areas typically really white-colored sand, which we'll talk about a little bit more later, running in from the Arabian Gulf Coast alone. And when you look there, there are divisions even within that unit. So for example, if you go from Tawila on the border of Abu Dhabi and Dubai, and you move northwards through Dubai, historically, all the way to Ras Al Khaimah, you would have these beautiful white sandy beaches. Now, much of that coastline has been heavily developed. We have the monstrous footprint of Dubai, then Sharjah, Ajman, Al Quwain, and there's very little areas there that haven't been developed, but when you find those areas, you'll see these beautiful white sandy beaches that basically extend inland for many, many kilometers. And we get beautiful organisms in those natural sandy areas like the wonder gecko that we'll see a little bit later. Further to the west, in western Abu Dhabi, you'll see areas of sabkha, or salt flats, if you prefer the English term. And these will extend for many miles inland, and we have one of the world's largest sabkha mati, that occurs between the UAE and Qatar, that extends far, far inland, almost to the empty quarter. We, of course, have lagoonal areas like this giant lagoonal sandspit that you see in Al Quwain, which in these lagoonal areas, particularly here in Abu Dhabi, you tend to get dense growth of mangroves. So primarily it's one species here, it's called Avicennia marina, and my lab group has sequenced the genome of this guy. Very unusually adapted to the unique environmental conditions we have here. Sometimes you get even rarer things like these fossilized dunes that you see here, which sort of give us a perspective on the change in climate that has happened here and a change in sea level that has occurred here in the UAE in the past that we don't really think about. And of course, occasionally you get rocky headlands plummeting into the shoreline in places like Rams and Ras Al Khaimah as well. And each of these, of course, hosts their own unique assemblages of organisms. The largest component of the UAE, as we mentioned, is the sand desert, but of course it is not homogeneous either. When we're talking about the sand desert, many of us will think of these massive dunes that you tend to see in areas like the Ruba Khali, the empty quarter, where you can get dunes that are upwards of 300 meters high. But of course, you also have sand dunes that extend up towards the mountain ranges, and you'll actually see, if you look a little more closely, that there's actually a dance going on between the sand dunes and the mountains. So right now we're in an era of climate that's quite dry for the UAE, and so the mountains, or sorry, the sand dunes are winning this battle. In wetter periods, because of the water running off of the mountains, the sand dunes will move further away. And in fact, if you think of a place like Dubai, it's actually built on an old wadi bed with just a little sand overlaying it that most people don't even recognize. You'll also notice differences in the color of sand as you travel around the UAE. So much of the sand, when you go into the empty quarter or over towards the mountains, you'll see this beautiful sort of red coloration to these sand dunes that you can see here. That's largely because they're full of iron, and so that iron rusts, giving us this really reddish color. But that sand that you can see here and here is not coming from the Hajar Mountains. This sand was deposited here by wind from central Arabia, and it's been eroding over millions of years and blowing over this way. And so all of the sand dunes that you think of are not actually generated here in the UAE, but have been coming in from Saudi. Versus the coastal sands along the coastlines here, which tend to have this beautiful white color to them, like the picture I showed you on the last slide. That's because they're marine in origin. So that sand is actually broken up shells that have been ground down by the waves and so on, and then pushed up onto land, giving us that beautiful white coloration. And because of the differences in chemistry between these two types of sand, you get very different assemblages of plants growing there, which means you also get different types of communities of other organisms. We, of course, have variation within the sand deserts themselves. You get these beautiful upwards of 300-meter dunes in the empty quarter. And in the back of that dune, you can see there's a large flat pan that's there. That's Sebkha. And so we've got these massive dunes sort of in dance with the underlying Sebkha environment that's sitting there. And these Sebkha that are in the midst of all of these massive sand dunes are actually sitting right... So these sand dunes, just going back for a second, although you think of them as the highest sand dunes in the UAE, they're actually lower elevation than the ones that I showed you on the last slide that are next to the mountains. Because as we get closer to the mountains, we're going up and up and up and up. These ones, yes, they're 300 meters high, but they're basically just sitting on top of sea level. And so if you actually dig down in those salt pans that are between the giant sand dunes, the freshwater lens that's sitting on top of salt water is very, very close to the surface, which is why you get a place like Liwa as an oasis historically. It's because the access to the surface water that's sitting there. As you leave the big dunes and you start moving towards the coast, you go into these sort of sandy flats that you can see here, which eventually transition into the coastal dune systems that you can see here over on the right. And you get these dunes that are shaped like a crescent moon. They're called Barkin dunes. These are mobile. And so after wind events, these will move around, and you can actually track the dance of these if you stay out camping long enough. Of course, we have other areas, particularly in the northern Emirates, where you'll get these large copse of gaff trees, which is the national tree of the UAE. And in fact, what you're looking at is the vestige of a time in the UAE that was much wetter, about 6,000 years ago. So the UAE basically looked like a savanna about 6,000 years ago. It was called the climactic optimum. It's when there was a lot of civilization developing in this area, and these would have been all over the places. Now, as we shifted around 5,000 years ago into this, what was called the dark millennium, into the period we're in now, where it's very dry, much of this has all died off, and we're just left with some areas where they've got deep enough roots to tap into the groundwater that's in those areas. And of course, I don't know what happened to my photo here, but you also have the sands intersecting with some of these foreland ridges that are sticking out from the mountains, and they have their own unique geology, and so you end up sometimes, in many cases, with species of vegetation as well as sometimes animal organisms that only occur in these areas because of the unique geology that's there. They're called endemic species, so super high conservation value because they occur nowhere else in the Emirates, or worldwide even. So moving out of the sandy areas and into the mountain ranges, of course, you're familiar with the mountain range that you've all driven through, I'm sure, to go to the East Coast, which is called the Hajar Mountain Range. This extends southward into Oman, basically up until Jabal Akhdar, so sort of west of Muscat. And so it's sort of the north end of a much larger mountain range that's in this area. And I'll talk about its formation a little bit later. But you can see that the highest points are actually occurring in Oman, around Jabal Akhdar area. And so as we get further north, they're getting lower in elevation. So the highest mountains that we get in the Hajar Mountain Range are only around 1,000 meters. So really, they're just sort of big hills rather than mountains. And when you think of these mountains, they really do represent a huge biodiversity hotspot. So the mountains of the UAE occupy only 5% of the area of the Emirates, but they contain 60% of all vegetation, the species of vegetation that occur in the Emirates. So really important in terms of biodiversity of plants, which means they also support around 60% of the animal species that occur in the UAE, including a number of species that occur nowhere else in the Emirates, of course. And this is largely because we have such great heterogeneity of microenvironments that are here. You've got changes in elevation, which come with changes in humidity and moisture. And also, of course, you have at the base of these wadis areas where water may pool or collect just underground, which of course helps with the survival of life. And as we'll discuss, all of these rocks have unique geology as well, which can drive life. That's not me making that noise. I don't know where that's coming from. This, of course, leads to the mountains being a center of what's called endemism. So an endemic species is a species that only occurs in one location on Earth and nowhere else. And so we have a number of species, all of these species that are shown here, as well as many more, that are endemic to the UAE, specifically in the Hajar mountain ranges. And so you will not find these anywhere else on Earth, including these beautiful blue-headed agamas and that crazy-looking spider that's over here. Bridgie's cringing right now. So why is it that we have mountains on the UAE's east coast? Well, you may not know this, but you're sitting on the world's smallest tectonic plate right now, the Arabian Plate, and it's been ripping off of Africa for the last 70 million years or so. And as it's ripping off of Africa, we get the formation of the Red Sea. There's a big rift that's happening here because it's unzipping. And so that's why the Red Sea is so deep. And as it's going over towards the Eurasian plate this direction, so it's moving sort of counterclockwise by about 2 millimeters a year, it's actually sliding under the Eurasian plate. And so when you see the Hajar Mountains on the UAE's east coast, what you're actually seeing is a lip of the Eurasian plate sticking up. And if you think about that, well, then that gives you a perspective inside of the world's, the Earth's surface, right? So you can see a bit of the crust, you can see the bottom of the crust and the upper mantle, and so you can see these different layers of geology by sort of walking through the Hajar Mountains from west to east. And so when we're looking at the Hajar Mountains, we typically think of them as these big, blocky, beautiful, sort of purpley brown rocks that we have on the East Coast. That rock that you're looking at in this picture is a group that geologists call ophiolite, an ultra-basic rock. And it's functionally falls into two categories within the ophiolite. Some of them are called gabbro, which you can see in, I think, yellow or orange, and green. And so that, the gabbro that you see over here, is basically representing the crust of the Earth. And as you get sort of, because this is, again, an unzipping of the Earth's surface, as you get a little bit deeper, you're looking at the upper mantle and this part that's labeled in purple over here, which is called Harzburgite. And these have completely different geology. So Harzburgite is basically plants do not like to grow in it. So you have much lower diversity of plants growing in this area that's labeled in purple than you do in these areas labeled in green and orange that are over here. And very different communities of plants, regardless. But you do get some unique sort of ophiolite lovers that really like that Harzburgite. And so a couple of endemic species of plants will only grow in this purple stuff and occur nowhere else in the Emirates or in Arabia for a large part in many cases. And when you think of the mountains, you may have different perspectives in your head. You may have this picture over here where you see a barren landscape that's just rocky and no vegetation whatsoever, or you may have a picture in your head that includes a whole bunch of vegetation. And what really you're thinking about depends on where you are in the wadi system. Are you at the base of the mountains, or are you in the upper tributaries? Because at the base of the mountains, in these lower reaches, we call them, of these wadi systems, when you get any rainfall event, all those smaller tributaries are feeding into that, and so you get these massive flash floods that occur, and they will rip through that the base of that wadi, taking anything that's there with them, including all the vegetation. They'll turn over the rocks, and so when you look at these large wadi systems, there's very little vegetation in them, especially at the base of the wadis. You might get a few plants clinging here and there to the sides, but they're functionally barren because of this storm flood that goes through. When you get up to the upper reaches of these wadis instead, you will start to see a lot of vegetation. And the reason is, but yes, it will rain up there, but they're so small and the catchment area is so small that it'll allow the water to trickle through without rushing through with enough speed to rip out these plants. And so they tend to be much more lush in the upper areas of these tributaries. And so you get this beautiful patches of vegetation, particularly along the edges. And you may even have water running through here in what's called the hyporheic zone, just under the gravel, and you just can't see it. And what's going on there is that, so this is a cross-section of a wadi, and then we're looking at it longitudinally going downhill in the second panel that's here. And so those big rocky mountains that we were talking about a moment ago, they basically, any water that hits it will run off. There's no way for the water to penetrate the bedrock, and so it'll just run downhill. And it'll go into those gravel areas that we were just looking at in the last slide and eventually collect in the bottom of those gravel areas. Now, the water is sitting underground. You can't see it, but it is running. It will run through this gravel very slowly. So there's a lot of bacterial activity in there, and there's really interesting stuff that's going on with the chemistry of the water, particularly around nutrients. And so it'll run down through the gravel along the bedrock that's sort of just sitting below the gravel until occasionally the bedrock pops up for whatever reason. And we call these sills. And when that happens, the water can't go through the bedrock, so it sort of pools up in those areas, and eventually it'll pop to the surface. And so you will get these little pools of water that form occasionally as you go through a lot of these wadis. And so there's actually 27 wadis, or wadi'in, in the UAE that have permanently flowing water. Now, they are under threat because the farmers are using wells to extract this water, and that's going to, of course, affect the flow of water that's going downstream. But very important biologically. So, for example, you may not know this, but if you took entomology in college, you would know that most insects require water to complete their life cycle. And so they will lay eggs in a little pond, they'll turn into something that feeds for a bit, and then it turns into a fly, basically to reproduce. And it goes off, reproduces, and then dies. And so many organisms rely on these sources of water for reproduction. And then, of course, you get these types of organisms like you have here, like the water scorpion. It's not actually a scorpion. That's that big tail that you see there is a breathing tube. But they only live in water. So, of course, if we lose those pools like you see up here, then you lose those species for the UAE. So critically important for these guys, as well as different species of fish. Like you can see these two species of fish here, one of which is the gara. These, of course, only occur in the freshwater pools that we have in the wadi systems in the Hajar mountain range. So aside from the Hajar mountains, the big sort of purpley brown colored mountains, or at least that's what I think they are because I'm colorblind, but we also have these beautiful, more white colored mountains that you'll notice up towards Ras Al Khaimah and then northwards into the Musandam Peninsula. And that area is called the Rus Al Jabal. And so you can see that these are much bigger mountains than you get in the Hajar mountain range. So the Hajar mountains, typically the highest point is going to be around 1,000 meters. Here, these ones can go upwards of 2,500 meters. So the highest point, yes, is in Oman, but it's in that general area of northern Ras Al Khaimah, northern Fujairah. And when you look at it, you'll see this massive, thick block that's functionally 3 kilometers high that's sitting on top of what was the other mountains that we just looked at. And what's happened here is this used to be the bottom of the sea when we had the Tethys Sea. And what was happening over time is, you've got on the bottom of the sea particles of stuff falling down and building up over time, and then it's building up. And so you're getting this layer cake of sediments building over time. at the bottom of the sea just because of erosion. And then that's been uplifted here as we've sort of slammed the Arabian plate into the Eurasian plate, and it's sort of been blobbed on top of the Hajar mountain range. And so you can really see these layers very clearly here. They're unique geology as well. So these are limestone, completely different geology than the type of rocks that are in the Hajar mountain range. You can even see it just looking at it. Things like, so when you use quarried rock from here and you build breakwaters, for example, in Dubai, they build some from Gabbro, from like Masafi, and then they use some from Ras Al Khaimah that are limestone, and corals really like growing on limestone compared to Gabbro. So it can make differences in terms of the life that occurs in these areas. But one thing you'll notice is if you do spend time up there is that there's no surface water. You can't find surface water in the Rus Al Jabal. That's because the rain is so acidic, it basically dissolves the limestone that's here. And so there's large caves and cracks and crevices where the water just migrates through. But you do get, because of this really high elevation, really unique things that humans have done. So we've got these terraced farms that occur in the Rus Al Jabal, which are really interesting because basically by living at altitude, you're escaping the heat that's occurring down at sea level, and so you can have farming occurring in those areas. Aside from the main mountain ranges, we also have the ones that people forget about, like the ugly cousin or something, which is, of course, Jebel Hafid, and places like Fossil Rock, if you're familiar with that, Jebel Faya, that you can see a little further north in Sharjah, Maliha, etc. These are geologically very similar to the Rus Al Jabal range, so largely made of limestone, but much younger. So these ones are only about 30 million years old. And they're about 25 kilometers or so off the main mountain track that you can see running this way. Again, because of their unique geology, we have organisms like this plant that is here, and the butterfly that feeds only on this plant. These only occur on the northern face of Jebel Hafid in the world. And so they are an endemic species that occurs there, and there's a lot of different endemic species that occur on Jebel Hafid, for example. So really a unique environment for life, and an amazing place to get out to on the weekend if you have the chance. And then we also, of course, have next to the mountains the alluvial plains. And so when you drive up to the mountains, you'll see these massive sort of terraces of gravel that are sitting there. This is, of course, just the mountains eroding over time. And these can be tens of meters thick, depending on where you are. And sometimes if you even drive through the wadis, you'll see them going up high. So avoid those areas if it's raining, though. And of course, those gravel terraces will slowly erode into the desert until you eventually get this sort of intermingling of the gravel plains with the sandy deserts, where you tend to get a lot of things like acacia growing. So these are an acacia tree, same species that occurs in a place like Kenya. They're much smaller here than you'll get in Kenya just because of the harshness of the environment that we have here. And the reason we have so many of them here, so this is a picture from the mountains looking out to Fujairah, is because they have what are called tap roots. So their roots can go down 30 meters, sometimes more. And so they're able to tap into that groundwater that's running through the gravel off of the mountains that none of us see, none of us think about, but it is there all year round. So this brings us sort of to the UAE in a larger sort of geographic perspective, and you have to recognize that we're sort of sitting at an exchange point between three very different biological environments. So you have the Afrotropical area down here, the Oriental area that we have here, and the Palearctic up here. All of these have their own unique organisms that are adapted to those different environments, and the UAE sits in the center of them as sort of a nexus of exchange. And that gives us really unique biodiversity here because of this sort of collection point that we're sitting on. But on top of that, we don't just have the exchange from these three different biogeographic provinces. We're also sitting in what's called the Eremic zone, which is the arid zone, which really structures this unique assemblage of organisms that we have occurring here in the UAE. And you see examples of these different signatures from different parts of the world just by walking around in the desert here. So for example, we talked a moment ago about acacia as well as this desert broom that you can see here. These are species of plants that have African origins, and we're getting them influenced from the African perspective coming into the UAE. We also have ones that are coming from Asia. So for example, the gaff tree, the national tree of the UAE, you'll see it's largely centered around places like Pakistan. So we're getting influences from the Orient as well, and then ones that you may not even know occur here in the UAE. So this is a Mediterranean plant. Anyone know what that is? It's the plant of peace. It's the olive tree. We have olives occurring here in the UAE in the highlands of Fujairah. And so this is wild olive tree that you can see here. And then, of course, we have highly desert-adapted species like this desert white butterfly that you can see over here. So it really is an amazing place to live. And again, I'd encourage you to get out there, learn a little bit from the book, and go and try and find these places. Well, maybe not the olive trees. That one's a little hairy to get to. All right, so we've been talking a lot about geography and not at all about geology other than the mountains. And that's functionally because the mountains are the only place that you can see geology here in the UAE. But it's also because geology isn't really important for life. Geography is much more important for structuring life here in the Emirates. And that's because when you think of the UAE, it's largely sand. And the sand is sitting on top of the geology, and so we don't really get any interaction with it. And so I'm not going to talk about geology much today, other than to point out, we've got, yes, exposed geology over in the Hajar Mountains, but most of our geology is actually sitting underground. And this layer cake that you can see here is the same layer cake that you'll see if you go up to the Musandam Peninsula, to Rus Al Jabal, the picture I showed you a little bit earlier. Just by happenstance or luck, the Trucial states happen to sit in an area of this where we had way back, roughly 500 million years ago through about 420 million years ago, a bunch of organisms like algae and other things that were growing in the Tethys Sea, slowly dying and falling down and sinking to the bottom of the sea and then getting buried by sand. And then more of them died, getting buried by sand. And over time, you get this layer cake building up, which is a huge amount of pressure being put on them, which gives you temperature and pressure together. And so functionally, you start to cook those algae. And what we get as a result of that is what the UAE got onto the world stage with about 70 years ago, which is oil. And so that oil sits in between these strata that you can see here. And now, like this, there's porous cracks and crevices and things like that. So the oil will actually migrate through these. It's trying to get out of this intense pressure, and it's slowly migrating up. And so the oil will migrate through our layered cake until it gets to a point where it can't migrate anymore. And those are typically under layers of salt from evaporation of these early seas when they got too shallow. And once they get to that salt cap, they can't go anymore. But the oil keeps coming and building up under that salt cap. And eventually you'll get sort of think of it like a pimple forming. It'll start to rise up and then it'll blister, and it's sitting there like that, except it's geological. And if you want to think of an analog of this, think of Jebel Dana, think of Serbenias Island, Delma Island. All of these are what are called salt domes. So it's where the surface of the earth has been uplifted by this massive amount of oil that's sitting under a salt cap under there, pushing up on it. So all those little mountains that are off the coast of Abu Dhabi, and a few of them like Jebel Dana on our coastline, are basically caused by oil uplifting under them. But like I said, that's not important for life, but it is important for the UAE. But just one other thing to point out here. You think of the UAE as this land with a bit of mountains and a lot of sandy desert. The sand is actually superficial. That sand its maximum depth is only around 30 meters typically. And so just sitting under that is these rocky ledges that we're talking about here. And so while we think of this place as being sandy from a geological perspective, it's not at all. It's just a veneer. So that covers the geography and geology of the UAE, but of course this is that helps drive life, but of course the organisms have to adapt to the climate that we have here. And when all of us think of the UAE, we think of it being a desert. But when you bring this out to a larger global perspective, and you look at a map of the world, which many of you in the room probably have before, have you ever wondered why it is that we get deserts where we get them? So if you're looking, we see this large band of desert here that's called the Sahara, and if you don't speak Arabic, Sahara means desert, so it's sort of, to say Sahara Desert's kind of ridiculous. We of course have the Arabian Desert, various other deserts that are over here. You've got the Great Desert in Australia, Namib, Patagonian Atacama, you've got the Sonoran and Chihuahuan Desert and various others that are around. And if you start to pay attention, you might notice that they occur basically in the same part of the world. It's basically 30 degrees north and then again 30 degrees south. Now we would, if South Africa extended a little bit further, you'd see more desert. It's just that it's ocean there. So why is that? Well, what goes on is we have in our atmosphere something called convection cells. And there's 3 big convection cells that go from the equator to the pole. And the first one's named after the fellow who discovered it, Gustav Hadley. And what he described was this process that's being driven by the sun. And so when you think of the Earth looking at the sun, and it's rolling around in space, where is the sun hitting the Earth the most? Well, it's going to hit the Earth the most around the equator, right? And as you get further and further towards the poles, the angle of attack, if you want to call it that, gets deeper. And so it's not getting as much light at the poles as you get at the equator. And so what that means is the heat is going to heat up the most around the equator. And if you heat up the land, you heat up the air that's sitting on the land. And so around the equator, it's getting most of the heat. The air is warming up above the equator. And so it starts to rise because as things get hotter, they get less dense. And so as it's rising above the equator, but most of the world is ocean, first of all, and then even on land, you've got vegetation that's releasing water and so on. And so as it's rising, it's bringing that moisture with it. And so if you look at a map of the world, not like this picture here where we've removed the clouds, but an actual picture of the world, you'll see around the equator a band of clouds at all times. And that's the start of the Hadley cell. And so what's happening is we've got this rising up here, and as it cools down, as we go up in altitude, you get it condensing into clouds. And then those clouds get thick enough, what do you get? Rain. And so the rain starts to fall around the equator. And so we always have this persistent layer of clouds around the equator dropping rainfall there. Great. So this air is rising still. It's dropping all the moisture, and it keeps rising until it hits this thing that we call the tropopause. So there's this change in temperature that occurs between the air you're breathing right now and the stratosphere where the ozone layer is. And so it functionally is a glass ceiling above us about 10 kilometers up that we can't see, but is definitely there. And so this air rises up until it hits this glass, and then it goes, I can't rise anymore, so I got to spread out. And that's exactly what happens. Some of it goes north or south in this example, and some of it goes north. And so it spreads in those 2 different directions, and then it starts to fall. And so as it's falling, it falls down at 30 degrees south and 30 degrees north, giving us our Hadley cells. But that air that's falling, is it dry or moist? It's dry because we lost all the moisture with the rainfall at the equator, right? And so what's happening is right here, that air is falling down on the Sahara, on Arabia, and these various other places. It's falling down from 10 kilometers up, and it's super dry. As it's falling, it's getting warmer, which makes it even harder for it to hold moisture. And so when you think of these areas, they never have clouds, very little rainfall, a lot of solar insolation. So if you do get a little bit of rainfall, it immediately evaporates, right? So really harsh, arid environments across this 30-degree band that you see here. So that is our Tropic of Cancer. Of course, in the southern hemisphere, it's the Tropic of Capricorn, and that's why we're sitting in a desert today. And of course, around the equator, it's always very green. That's where we have our tropical rainforests. And so we're sitting just above the Tropic of Cancer here in Abu Dhabi today. Something that really helps structure the regional climate here, of course, are winds. And these winds are largely driven by that convection cycle that I just showed you on the last slide. And so we've got a picture here of the winds in wintertime, so this is January, as well as in summertime. And one thing you'll notice is if you look at the Gulf here, the winds are coming from the north to the south, from the north to the south, basically all the time. And so in Arabic, we call them the shamal winds. But if you go out on pretty much any day of the year, you will find the winds coming from the north, or the north-northwest to be specific. And so they're called the shamal winds. But the reason we have shamal winds in the winter and the summer differs. So what's happening in the winter time here is of course, as we're going through the seasons, the Earth is rotating, tilting on its axis. And so this convection cycle that we looked at on the last slide is moving. And so what's happening here is that 30-degree drop of dry air is actually landing down here, in Central Arabia. And as it's falling here in this area where you can see there's no arrows, that's just the air falling from straight down. As it's falling down and starting to move out, you can see it's bending, and that's because the Earth is rotating, so we get these Coriolis forces. As the air is moving out from this area, it's getting bent to the right. In the summertime, it's a different story. We're now, like, the convection cycle has moved way up, and you can actually see the air is rising around Arabia. So this is the Bab el-Mandeb Strait down at the bottom of the Red Sea. Here, the air is rising, and so that's the beginning. And what you can see is air is getting pulled into where it's rising right here from this surrounding area. So it's flying in here to replace the air that's rising up in this area, again giving us our north-northwest winds, the Shamal winds, but for a completely different reason. But we almost consistently have winds from the north-northwest here. The only time we don't is just before we get a really strong Shamal event. So when we get storms like we had a few weeks ago, the day before, in local lore, they call it the land is breathing. These are called Kaus winds, where just beforehand you'll see the winds coming off the land, and if you feel that for a day, you know there's a really bad storm coming the next day. So those are sort of the seasonal cycles of wind, but of course we have every day what are called sea breezes. And so just before you come into this talk tonight, if you sat in front of SeaWorld and you look towards Saadiyat Island, you would feel the wind on your face. What's going on there is during the daytime, the desert that we have here heats up a lot, right? Whereas the sea, because it has lower thermal capacity, it can't take as much heat, it stays cooler during the daytime. And so as this land heats up, the air there starts to rise, and so it's just rising up, but something has to replace the air that's rising, so it comes in from the sea. And so I own a sailboat, I keep it at Dosk in Dubai, and so I can guarantee pretty much every day at around 12:30, you'll start getting the sea breeze forming because the land is hot enough at that point, and you will have beautiful winds until about 6 o'clock, 6:30, and as the sun sets, the winds die, which is perfect time to get your boat in and get up to the clubhouse. In the morning, if you get up tomorrow morning and you look inland, so look towards Al Ain when you get up tomorrow morning, you'll feel the wind on your face. Because at nighttime, it's the opposite process. The land becomes very cold because it's a desert, we don't have vegetation here. Because it's so cold, the water is warmer, so the air above the water rises, and then it comes in off the land to replace it. So this, you'll only feel the land breeze in the morning in the very early hours, so just after sunrise, because once it gets hot, of course, we switch back to this. So we have a weak land breeze, but a really strong sea breeze here. And so pretty much any day, walk outside after 1 o'clock in the afternoon, I guarantee if you're facing the wind, you're going to be looking north-northwest. All right, so what about temperatures? News flash for everyone in the room, this place gets hot. So this is our temperature in wintertime in January and our temperature in summertime in July. Yeah, it gets hot here in the summertime. End of slide. No. What I wanted to point out is that there's a huge range of variability, obviously, between the winter and the summer, but if you actually look closer at these two maps of the UAE, one thing you'll notice is that where are the extreme temperatures? The more extreme temperatures are inland, and that's because the Arabian Gulf here and the Indian Ocean over here basically buffer those temperatures. So you're always going to have colder winters and hotter summers in a place like Al Ain versus a place like Dubai or Abu Dhabi, just because of the buffering temperatures of the water. What about climate change? Is that actually a thing? Is it happening? Well, this is data that we've reanalyzed from the 1980s. So this is an average for July for every year through the 1980s versus the 2010s up until 2020. And you look at these graphics and they look almost exactly the same, except every number is up by 1. And so if we go to a place like Al Ain, it was 43 in the 1980s and it's around 44 today. If you go to the coastline around Abu Dhabi, it was 42, now it's 43. And you go, well, 1 degree in 40 years, not a big deal. But if you're familiar with the United Nations Climate Change Group and what number they think is important, what's that number? How many degrees? 1.5 degrees, that's right. So in the past 40 years, we have already kicked over that 1 degree, and we're very quickly approaching that 1.5. And I suspect here in the UAE, we're going to hit that in the 2040s or something like that. I can tell you, I won't mention this later, but the Arabian Gulf, we've gone up by 1.6 degrees Celsius. And that's nearly double the global average, and it's because of the unique environment that we have in the Gulf. So the water's warming even faster. What about rainfall? So it does rain here, as you discovered last month, but very rarely. And most of that rain that happens, of course, happens in the wintertime. Everyone who lives here knows that. What you may be less familiar with is that most of that rainfall is also not just seasonal, but spatially constrained. Most of the rainfall happens around the mountain areas. And that's simply because the mountains are high elevation. Any air that passes over them has to go up, gets colder, so it drops out that water that's in it. And so, yeah, the vast majority, something like 90% of the water falls in the mountains and in the wintertime, and you get occasional sprinkles the rest of the time. What about the changes since the 1980s versus today in terms of the amount of rainfall? This is very troubling. The amount of rainfall in the last decade versus the 4 decades ago has gone down by half. And so when you think of already water-stressed organisms that are living in an arid to hyper-arid environment, this is incredibly important because it means it's going to really structure the organisms that can survive here and how much they can flourish. And so this is very troubling. Now, what's going to happen in the future, we don't know. So I work with climate modelers at NYU, and what really drives our rainfall here is the monsoon in the Indian Ocean. And half of the models say it's going to get stronger, half of the models say it's going to get weaker, so there's no consensus on what's going to happen over the next couple of decades with the monsoon, and therefore we're not sure if this is a long-term trend or it's just a variation over a couple of decades, so watch this space. And lastly, I'll talk about the marine environment of the UAE, something that's close to my home. So you may not recognize that this puddle of water that we live next to is actually one of the shallowest seas in the world. So the average depth of the Gulf is only 30 meters. And if you go from the coastline of Abu Dhabi out in a boat, you can go out for miles and miles and miles. It'll still be less than 10 meters deep. So this is a puddle. And it's functionally a puddle that's forming because of that little downfolding that's happening of the Arabian plate under the Eurasian plate. So this is Iran, of course, over here, and it's getting uplifted as the Arabian plate gets subducted under it. And so we've got this small little marginal sea with a very narrow entrance to it that's only 42 kilometers wide at its widest point. And so this makes this an unusual pressure cooker for organisms that live here because it's shallow, the temperature can go from very extreme hot to very extreme cold in summer to winter, and we don't have a lot of flushing. And so, plus the high evaporation rates that we have here means it's a very salty sea relative to most parts of the world. You may not also know that the Gulf is a super young sea. So the coastline of the modern Gulf is only 6,000 years old, which is nothing. Human civilization is 10,000 years old. From a geological perspective, it's like a nanosecond. And this map, which is a paper we published a few years ago, shows the transgression after the last ice age. So we had, during the last ice age, these massive 3-kilometer plus high sheets of ice that are sitting on top of places like Canada and Scandinavia and so on. That ice got made from seawater. And so the sea levels during the last ice age were about 120 meters below where they are today. And when I say that the Gulf was on average 30 meters deep, well, what does that mean? Well, it means there is no Gulf during the last ice age. So this whole area that's here was, because it was a cooler and more humid climate then, this whole area was savanna, all the way across to the mountains in Iran that are over here. The only water that was in this area was these two little rivers that we have up here today. We call them the Tigris-Euphrates rivers. Then they were called the Shat-Ur River. And it basically combined and came down along the coast of Iran through the deepest part of the Gulf, which is only 90 meters, and then it spilled out into the Indian Ocean over here. So there was no Gulf during the last ice age. And it's only when the ice sheets started melting around 18,000 years ago that the sea level started to rise. And so they initially rise from here. That was thought to be the modern coastline way back then. And then we get this infiltration of water, again along the deepest part of the Gulf over towards Iran. Give it a few more thousand years, it starts to spread out, but again, sticking to the deeper part of the Gulf over towards the coast of Iran, but moving a little bit north at this point. And then a few more thousand years, it's starting to spread out towards Abu Dhabi, over towards Saudi and Bahrain and Qatar, until eventually we get this coastline that we're sitting on today, which, as I mentioned, is only around 6,000 years old. It actually went a little bit higher. We're about a meter higher than today's sea levels. And so there's archaeological sites in the UAE, like Dur, I think it's called, that's up towards Al Quwain. That's actually about 10 kilometers in from the modern coastline, but it was a coastal village during the period that sea levels were a little bit higher. So very young sea in what we will describe as a very extreme environment, which means it really was an evolutionary pressure cooker of natural selection. So you had to change really fast to survive in this environment or you were wiped out. So looking at the geographic features of the UAE's east coast, we've got our coastline along the Arabian Gulf that you can see here. Of course, what structures a lot of what goes on here is the wind that we've been discussing. And over here, when you look at the area that's basically from Dubai up to Ras Al Khaimah, what you get are large areas of sandy barrier islands that are actually moving. We just don't see it because they're moving slowly. And these give us, of course, the beautiful lagoons that you have in places like Al Quwain. But Ras Al Khaimah is actually a lagoon. You just don't recognize it because there's buildings all over it now. But there are massive lagoons that are running up this coast because the wind is basically moving that sand along these mobile coasts. Very exposed, constantly moving. When you move down towards the area from the Dubai border, functionally down to Jebel Dana, we get a slightly different story where offshore we have rocky bottom. And in those areas where we have rocky bottom, you get coral reefs growing and you get oyster reefs growing. And think of them as natural breakwaters. What they do is they can kick over waves and that protects the coastline. And so if you get these rocky coral reefs or oyster reefs, it'll protect the coastline and then you'll get barrier islands forming behind them. So for example, this island that we think of here, Abu Dhabi, as our home, this is an island that was behind a historic coral reef that occurred here. So it's no longer there, it's under Lulu Island, but there was a massive coral reef that occurred here, which is why people settled in Abu Dhabi. They were fishing on that reef as a food source. If you think of Saadiyat, there is still an existing coral reef that's here. Bahraini Island, there's a coral reef that's there. So these reefs block the waves and allow the sand to build up in these areas, and then eventually you get mangroves and seagrasses and other ecosystems forming behind these areas. And then further west, you get areas like this. Now, this area does not get exposed to the wind because the Qatar Peninsula functionally blocks it. So we don't get big waves, we get a little bit of wind, but not as much as the exposed coasts. And that really structures what we get over there. Most of the coastline in that area just behind the beach itself is the Sabkha salt flats that you can see here. These are geologically very unique, really interesting places because the salt water from the sea is still coming through the sands and muds that are there, but then it's evaporating. And so you get these crusts of salt that are there, really unique chemistry underneath those salty crusts, and unique organisms that occur in these environments as well. Obviously, a very hostile environment. Offshore from those areas, we have large extents of shallow areas getting lots of light, beautiful temperatures during certain times of year. And so what you're seeing here is a map of seagrass beds. Here's a fact of the day, so you can use this at quiz night sometime. 4% of the entire world's seagrass beds, in terms of area, occur here in Abu Dhabi Emirate alone, not just in the UAE. So we have a huge amount of seagrass beds. That supports lots of organisms that people aren't really aware of, but like these beautiful dugongs that you can see here. So we have the second largest population of dugongs in the world. The first largest is in Australia. But think of the size of Australia versus Abu Dhabi. It's a massive continent, basically. And we've got a small patch of coastline in one of the world's hottest seas, yet we have the second largest population of dugongs in the world. So really remarkable. And of course, we also have things like massive populations of green turtles that feed on these seagrasses as well. Offshore on some of these, remember I talked about the salt domes, these little pimples? So there's examples of them here. All of these are where you also have a lot of oil and gas concessions. Anyway, around these salt domes, like Delma Island that you can see here and here, you'll also get coral reef development. So this is a picture of Delma Reef some years ago, just off of the top of Delma Island. So whenever you get rock coming up from the sandy, muddy bottom here, you'll get corals growing on it. But overlaying all of this is that extreme climate that we've been talking about before. So this is a map showing you the Indian Ocean during the summer a couple of years ago. And what really pops out is obviously the huge difference in temperature between the wider Indian Ocean and what we get here in the Arabian Gulf, particularly along the coastline of the UAE and Abu Dhabi in specific. So this is the world's hottest sea every summer. it will hit 36 degrees Celsius comfortably, and sometimes much higher than that, which is the same temperature as your blood. And to put this into context, because I know you're not touching your blood regularly, but if you draw a hot bath at home, or if you go home tonight for a shower, people tend to keep their water at 38 to 40 degrees. So this is very close to the temperature that you're showering in, is what our seawater is every single summer, and there's those ecosystems and the organisms that inhabit them living through this. Yet, 6 months later, the Gulf being shallow becomes freezing cold. And so we have temperatures that will drop down in the northern Gulf to the low teens. Here, we'll get around 17 degrees Celsius. Wait 6 months, it's back to summer, it's up to 36, 37 degrees Celsius. So this is the largest range of temperatures for any subtropical system as well. So we have both extremes and huge variability in temperatures, and organisms are trying to live through this on 6-month cycles. We can have extreme events that go even beyond these normal extremes. And so in the summer of 2017, we had a massive coral bleaching event. Summer of 2021 was even worse, so we had more coral bleaching. Plus, we also had mass mortality of green turtles, so they're a critically endangered species. I did a project for one of the oil companies because they thought they had a spill or something because all these dead turtles were washing up, and they're trying to understand what's going on. But it was actually just the extreme temperatures of the summer in 2021 during the pandemic. In a 4-kilometer stretch of beach, I surveyed over 120 massive, like more than 1 meter sized green turtles on just a 4-kilometer stretch of beach. What happened was it got so hot, it didn't kill them from heat exhaustion, it killed the bacteria in their gut. And so when the bacteria in their gut died, couldn't process the seagrass, and so they starved to death. And then they bloated, floated, and ended up on these beaches, unfortunately. So climate change is having impacts here. Some of it is direct, like we're talking about here, but we're also having indirect impacts from climate change. One of the things we've only recently discovered is that the biological oxygen demand in the water, so things like fishes, corals, crabs, all that stuff, its metabolism is based on temperature because they're all cold-blooded. So if it's warm, their metabolism goes up, they're using more oxygen, and we actually see recurrent periods through summertime where the water will actually go what's called hypoxic. It's so low oxygen that things like fish can't survive. Luckily, fish can swim. Unfortunately, things like corals cannot. And so we're not sure how much of the coral bleaching and die-off we've been seeing is due to temperature, which is what we've thought for decades, or temperature and this oxygen stressor working together. So it's something we're actively studying right now. So, crazy temperatures, but it's also super salty, as anyone who's gone swimming here in Abu Dhabi knows. And that's because of that evaporative environment, the high solar insolation, the lack of clouds, all of that leads to this being an evaporative basin. This is showing you sort of a cut through the Gulf. And so you can see Iran and the Zagros Mountains over here. And this is showing you the flow of water. So the fresher, normal ocean water comes in from the Indian Ocean over by Fujairah. And basically it trucks along the coast of Iran. And as it's moving along with this current, it's evaporating. And as it's evaporating, it's getting saltier and saltier and saltier. And as water gets saltier, it becomes heavier. And so there's a certain point where it no longer is floating, but it's actually starting to sink as it gets saltier and saltier. And so basically as it gets towards Iraq and Kuwait, sometimes northern Saudi Arabia, that water will start to sink, and it's then flowing along the bottom. So you've got this fresher water on top going this direction, the saltier water sitting on the bottom and going out, back down along the coast of Qatar and the UAE, and then out back into the Indian Ocean. And when I did that submarine ride, we had sensors on the submarine for looking at temperature and salinity and all sorts of stuff. And we're coming down from the surface, and it's sort of normal. And then at around 40 meters depth, we saw this massive spike in the salinity of the water, went down another 40, 50 meters, and then it went back to normal oceanic water. So this tongue of salt water is coming out of the Gulf, and you can actually see it going through the Gulf of Oman and into the Indian Ocean. And then you also have things like the shamal that we talked about earlier, these winds, because it's so shallow along the coast of the UAE, can also stir up the bottom. And so if any of you are snorkelers or divers, you know if it's windy, don't bother going out because it's so shallow, it stirs up all the sediments that are on the bottom. For typically 3 or 4 days, you can't really see anything in the water. It's all just sand, not much organic matter, nothing unhealthy about it. But you can even see it here where we had a shamal event and functionally the water turns into pea soup for a few days. So all of these different stressors, the temperature, the salinity, the turbidity, the oxygen, all of these things are sort of structuring what can and does survive here. Sticking on the point of the Shamal winds that we've been discussing, the north winds, one thing you have to recognize is these act like this. So every morning, or half of the room at least, will pour themselves a cup of coffee, and then you sit there and blow on it. Why are you blowing on it? To cool it down, that's right. So you don't know this, but you're doing a physics experiment. What you're doing is you're applying something that's called latent heat flux. So you're literally pulling energy out of that coffee through evaporative cooling. So when you blow on it, it's taking air across it that's pulling energy out of that coffee, making it cooler. And so what's happening on the Gulf-wide scale during summertime is the Shamal winds are functionally God blowing across the Arabian Gulf, cooling it down. And so if you have a nice period of winds for just 2 or 3 days during the summertime, it will cool the Gulf from 36, 37 degrees down to 34, 35 degrees. That is life and death differences. And so you can get cases where we will get a calm summer. So summer 2017, we had functionally no winds for about 3.5 weeks. And the water just kept getting hotter and hotter and hotter because we weren't getting that breath of fresh air across our coffee, and we had a massive coral bleaching event that year as a result of it. And so these Shamal winds are important for all sorts of reasons that people don't recognize. I should point out, these winds, when they blow, they're pulling out 400 watts per square meter. Your household air conditioner only pulls out about half of that. So super important in terms of the energy it's pulling out in heat. East coast of the UAE, much more benign environment. It's basically oceanic system over there, so a complete contrast from what we have here on the Arabian Gulf Coast. And you can see that here, the blue and purple, whatever these colors are, I can't really tell, green maybe. These ones are 2 or 3 degrees lower in the summertime and 2 or 3 degrees warmer in the wintertime. So it's a much less extreme temperature environment for organisms that live on the east coast of the UAE. And as a result of that, you get much more diverse and extensive things like coral reef ecosystems on the UAE's east coast because they can just survive there. We have much fewer species on this coast because things just can't survive this boiler that we put them through. And things like the monsoon and tides and all of that will really help structure the life that occurs over there. So this is a map showing you the coastline of Oman up until Ras Al Had, and then you've got the Gulf of Oman over here. And you can see there's this beautiful coloring of red that's occurring there. So what's happening here, this is summertime, and there's a wind that's blowing from Somalia up to India that we call the monsoon, right? As it's blowing across that water, it's causing the water to come from deep under the ocean, very cold water, full of nutrients, and well up along the coastline of Oman that's here, which is why Oman has such rich fisheries. And so these fingers of water, though, they can extend up here and keep the coral reefs that are occurring on the UAE's east coast cool. So this is showing you temperature graph from 2 years ago, June, July, August, as we're going through the monsoon season. So you can see there's the Gulf starting to heat up. It's getting super hot. Oh my God, it's boiling. But look at the east coast of the UAE. You can see these little fingers of water that are coming in here and keeping things cool along the coast. That's the influence of the monsoon and large-scale eddies that are forming, bringing cooler water from Oman up along the UAE's east coast and keeping us happy and healthy over there. But aside from those big seasonal factors, we also have on daily basis temperatures going up and down by upwards of 5 degrees Celsius, which is a huge amount, and that's just tide. So the tide's swashing across this island this way, and then this way as the tides go in and out. They'll take the deeper water that's offshore and bring it up over the coral reef, cooling it down for a few hours, which can help keep that coral reef alive if it's a period of intense heat. And so what we get as a result of that, these benign conditions that we have on the UAE's east coast is a much more diverse marine system than we have. And this is a beautiful picture of Shark Island a couple of years ago that occurs off of Corfacan. And so altogether, what I've given you today is the physical setting of the UAE, and I hope I've inspired you to learn a little bit more about the environmental setting that you're sitting in and how that helps structure life. I'll end with just 2 or 3 slides here talking about the other sections of the book, but not going into details. So we have the second section of the book focuses on the various different ecosystems that we have here in the Emirates. Of course, we have things like coral reefs and oyster beds that I've been talking about and people are familiar with. You may be less familiar with things like seaweeds and why they're so important here. The vegetation in the mountains, we go into much more detail in those chapters, and of course the beautiful mangroves that we have. We talk about the organisms that inhabit these ecosystems. So for example, the Arabian tar is included in the mammals chapter. The scary camel spider that does not actually harm you, of course, occurs in the arthropods, the insects chapter. And we talk about the reptiles and amphibians, for example. So those are our terrestrial groups of organisms, but of course we also go into the marine groups of organisms. Matt Mitchell has done the chapter on the fishes. We've got our dolphins, whales, and other critters in our marine mammals. And what has to be the best picture in the book, I don't know how Johannes Els got this, but it's a sea snake nailing a fish. And we close the book by talking a little bit about humans and how humans have interacted with the environment here in the Emirates over the many millennia that, of course, the Emirati population has occurred here through an archaeological perspective, but then spinning to the modern time by thinking about, well, we're building all these cities, and yes, they have had negative impacts on the environment, but there's also positives that a lot of people don't appreciate because the cities themselves become ecosystems for organisms. And we have these whole groups of organisms that are commensal with us and basically occur only in cities. And so we explore some of that in this chapter. And then we close the book by thinking about the Emirates as we know and love her and thinking, where is the Emirates going to be at 2050? So we have a trajectory that we're going on. Are there things that we can do different that could potentially help sustain some of these ecosystems and organisms more so than if we continue on the path that we're on? And so we close the book with a chapter that looks at some of these issues and makes some recommendations on policy and management. And with that, I'd just like to close by thanking the sponsor. So as I mentioned, yes, you can buy the physical copy of the book. Far more important to me is the fact that the book is completely open access and you can anyone in the world can look at this on their phone, their tablet, their laptop, or whatever. And it's an amazing resource, I think, particularly for educators. And that's all thanks to the sponsorship of our government partners at the university called Tamkeen, who have paid for this book to be open access so all of you can enjoy it. So please do share it through your social networks so that anyone else can go and have a look. Thank you very much.
Thanks, John. Can we hear? Hello? Can you hear?
It's on.
Me? Oh, okay, great. Thanks. Perfect. We're gonna just sit and take some questions.
Sure.
This was amazing, obviously, and yes, we need to get a book and read that, and just go there as well. Definitely. Just first question. We can just sit here. As we said, we will take some questions here, and then we will take the time as well to sign the book. So we'll have, thank you, a book signing after outside.
Thank you.
First question? Anyone? All right. Yes, over there. You should.
And my question is, what impact does desalination and the output brine have on the salinity levels here in the Gulf?
Sure. So desalination is how we produce our water primarily here in the UAE, especially for domestic purposes and so on. And the Arabian Gulf produces roughly 48% of the desal capacity in the world, and of that, roughly half of that, again, is just the UAE, so out of the 8 nations that border the Gulf. So we produce an incredible amount of water here through desalination processes. There's multiple environmental impacts that come from desalination. That's just something we have to accept, because without this process, we cannot survive here in this arid environment. And so there's impacts that occur on the sort of intake side, entrainment, entrapment, and so on. There's issues that occur, of course, with the CO2 emissions because of the power that's used to, this is very energy intensive, the power that's used to desalinate the water through whatever process it is. And then, of course, you have the brine discharge that's on the other end, which will, depending on the type of technology that's being used, it may be hotter by typically upwards of 10 degrees if it's thermal. But a lot of the newer technology is reverse osmosis, so you won't have that temperature impact, but you'll still have brines. And of course, it's an industry, and they don't want their pipes fouling up with things or getting covered with minerals, and so they use anti-scalants and anti-foulants and various other chemicals to keep all this network of pipes clean as well. So that also gets discharged out in the environment. So of course, you're going to have impacts on localized scales around these outfalls. When they build these, they do, of course, do environmental impact assessments to estimate what those impacts might be to the surrounding environment and avoid them, mitigate them, et cetera, as much as possible. We have done, so I can't specifically talk about any outfalls here because I haven't accessed any of them in order to be able to talk about the conditions at those, but we have modeled on a Gulf-wide scale. When you think the fact that the entire world, we as a Gulf are producing half of that desal, so therefore half of the brine going back into this very shallow, very enclosed sea, we were wondering if there might potentially be human forcing on the salinity of the Gulf, making it saltier, potentially hotter, but much less concerned about that from a physics perspective. And what we actually showed is that the Gulf has no impact on the salinity. So far more important is just natural evaporation rates, because you got to remember, salty water is heavy. So that water is going along the bottom and then exiting the Gulf, and it's actually speeding up the overturning circulation, that water that's coming in and going around and then back out again. So as we increase, so we've modeled it with just desal growth over the next 30 years or 25 years, as well as climate change. And we actually see the exchange of the Gulf speeding up as a result of climate change. So at least on the basin-wide scale, we're not concerned about the environmental impacts from the salinity perspective. But of course, there are the other factors that I talked about. Thank you.
Thanks. Sorry, I'm just gonna go this way. Come here.
Oh, I love kid questions. These are like always hard.
Hello, my name is Mohammed Rad Ahmed. I'm a 13-year-old. Earlier you mentioned about massive coral bleaching.
Yep.
Why is this such a problem? Because isn't the coral that grows in the Arabian Gulf specialized to the extreme temperatures?
That's a great question. Did someone plant that with you? So we do have the world's most heat-tolerant corals sitting here in the Arabian Gulf. They're renowned for their ability to tolerate extreme temperatures, but even they can get pushed over the ledge, right? And so we have seen in recent years, and it's because of climate change, unfortunately, that we're getting more frequent and more severe marine heat waves, as we call them. And so this is pushing corals over that edge because they're sitting right there at that ledge and it's not hard to push them over. So unfortunately, we do see losses of these sometimes. It depends on the year. Now, can they recover? Yes, coral reefs can regrow and recover, but it depends on them having time. Kind of like, you know, if you get sick, you need time to heal, right? The same thing goes on with coral reefs as well. So it's a question of, are these events going to keep happening frequently, or are we going to have a period of a decade or so, which is typically what you need for them to be able to recover? Great question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. I'm Najmuddin. I'm a mangroves ecologist.
You're an economist?
Mangroves ecologist.
Oh, okay,
Mangroves,
sorry.
Mangroves. I
Yeah.
work here since from 2000 up to now. And basically my question is there because we are talking about the natural history of the Emirates.
Yep.
As you mentioned, we know that only one species occurs here of mangroves, Avicenna marina. But there is something written that historical record shows that another species, Rhizophroma mucronata, once upon grows, 100 years ago grows here. But due to severe climatic changes or other factors, it completely disappeared.
Yep.
And in 2000, I was called from Pakistan to come here and do some research on Rhizophroma mucronata on reintroduction by His Highness Sheikh Khalifa in Abu Dhabi and Ras Ghanada Island. And we did a lot of research for 4 years from EAD, Environment Agency, Abu Dhabi. I was working there as a mangrove scientist, okay? And we successfully grow in the nurseries and also did a few plantations. Still they are growing there, but still it is not very clear, it's a confusion.
Yeah, so-
Really it occurs or no? What are the evidence of Rhizophora micronata
So we
in
had
the
a
UAE?
we had a 5-year multi-million-dollar project to sequence the genome of the mangrove, look for signatures of selection within the genome, so looking for genes that help it with stress tolerance, for example, for temperature or salinity. And we also, as part of that, did a lot of historical digging through the literature. We have seen quite recently, like in the last couple of decades, people talking about this Rhizophora being here. We saw no evidence of the original source of that, and we suspect that it's just someone talking, and then it's been picked up. Because if you follow the trail of citations back and back and back, they just keep referring back to something that we cannot find any evidence of in the records. I have not seen this species occurring naturally anywhere here, which makes me question the veracity of that. And also I have heard that they're extremely challenging to get growing here when people have tried to grow them, which again suggests that probably didn't naturally occur here. But yeah, I don't know, to be honest.
It is not clear. So it is not clear
Yeah.
100%.
That's right.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. Yes.
This is bad. I'm getting
Yeah,
a
this
question
is-
from the guy who's running the
I know.
Natural History Museum.
No. No, I just wanted to follow up. Najim in Vistro. Hi, nice to see you again after so many years. No, we have archaeological evidence for Rhizophora mucronata being here in UAE. We have archaeobotanical remains. Margareta
Gulf Coast or?
Gulf Coast, yeah.
Okay.
Margareta Tenberg, who's the archaeobotanist at the Natural History Museum in Paris, in her PhD, which is published, she published different articles. She studied the botanical remains from Tel Abrak. Tel Abrak is on the border of Sharjah and Al Quwain, so it's near the photograph you showed of all the lagoons of Al Quwain. So
When was Tel Abrak
it's
extant?
during the Bronze Age and Iron Age. So what's very interesting, and it's a reason why Rhizophora, we don't find it. It was here before, we think, because in the archaeobotanical record we have charcoal from Rhizophora, has very distinctive pattern. And it's known in Bronze Age. By the Iron Age, she noted in her assemblages, in the stratigraphy of the site, it decreases through time. Now, there's two reasons for that. One reason
Over-harvesting or
is
climate?
that over-harvesting, and also there's some climate things going on as well. But also Rhizophora, as you know, has the more umbrella shape with longer, straighter timbers. Rhizophora timber burns much better than Avicennia marina and has straighter timbers, so it was preferentially selected by humans for boats, for houses, for other things. And so we think actually it's one of the evidence for species that used to be endemic, but human impact. It's like Terebralia palustris, the gastropod shell. We have many evidence of it living in islands around Abu Dhabi, but now you can't find live examples. You can only find on the east coast now in Fujairah. So again, it's because of the more benign conditions there. So there's a combination of change through time, but human exploitation. So anyway, so there is archaeological evidence, and I think from some other places in the Gulf as well. But as I said, there are some publications. I can email you anyway the references. But historically,
That'd be helpful. Thank you.
Nice. Nice to know. Thank you, Mark. All right. I'll take a question over there, and then we go there. Yeah.
Hi, how are you doing? Sorry, I just had a quick question in regards to, you're talking about the deserts along the coast is mostly made of coastal shell material, and the sands in like the Malaya region and Abu Dhabi are mostly from Arabia that's sort of flown in. Usually along the mountain areas, they have something like the rain shadow effect, where the clouds will hit and release all the rain, and everything like to the west or the opposite side will be made of sand. So since that sand is mostly from Arabia, what would originally have been in that area? Would have been alluvial plains or gravel instead, and then that sand's just flown in and stayed in place?
Yeah, I think, like, I don't know for sure, but your logic makes sense to me that, it would have been much more extensive gravel plains that we still have today. So Sharjah sits on top of a big gravel plain, Ras Al Khaimah itself. So these were wadis that basically went out to the sea during the periods when it was much wetter here in the UAE. Now they're covered by a layer of sand, so we don't see them, we don't think about them, but they're still there if you dig down, right? You'll get from sand into gravel. And so our coastal cities are built around these environments. I suspect that may also be partially because you're going to get more access to groundwater in those areas. So just people probably didn't know it, but you build a well and you get water there, and you don't over in this other area, right? Because it's an old wadi bed, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, now it's just sand overlaying it.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Thanks. All right. We'll take the last question. I'm sorry. I know there are many questions left, but I guess you'll have to read the book and but we'll take one more question over there.
Where am I looking?
Over there. Yes.
Hello there. You know the rainfall that happened last month that was so heavy? What impact did it have on the environment?
Oh, that's a really good question. So I was in Ras Al Khaimah last week, and I don't know if any of you have had the chance to leave Abu Dhabi since the rain. If you get a chance this weekend or you're looking for something to do, get out of Abu Dhabi and drive north. It is amazing as you see it here a little bit, you see it more in Dubai, but as you get to Sharjah and further north, closer to the mountains, there is a huge amount of vegetation that has sprung up over the last couple of weeks. And so like the medians of the road where there's no camels are lush, like the vegetation is about this high and it looks like a field. So if you get a chance this weekend, get out and have a look. But you can also use that as a chance to actually look at what the impacts of camels is, because you'll see areas where there's fenced areas that the camels can't get to, and then areas where the camels are, and it's night and day the difference, because you have these beautiful fields of green and then sand. So.
All right. We're going to close the discussion right now. Thank you for coming. This is such a nice crowd tonight. Thank you so much, John, for stopping here.
And so the book, as I said, is available open access online. If people want a physical copy, unfortunately it's cash because I bought these and then brought them here because I know people are always interested in having the book. It's 200 dirhams, and there's a table out to the right here when you exit if you'd like to grab one that's there. And I'll be sitting there if you want it signed, but you can just take one and go, or I'm happy to sign one at some other point for folks.
Thank you. All right. Thank you, everyone. Next month, it's the thematic is sea turtles. Sea turtles, and it's going to be with Dr. Hind from the Environment Agency Abu Dhabi. So thank you. See you soon.
Thank you all.